Hello and welcome back to our campaign 2024 coverage here at the Washington Times. I'm George Gerbo. With just days to go before Election Day, we wanted to take a final look at the state of play in the 2024 presidential race between Donald Trump and Kamala Harris. And to do that, I have once again our talented team of national politics reporters, Seth McLaughlin and Susan Ferrechio. Good morning to you both.
Good morning.
Good morning, George.
Thanks for joining me. As always, the biggest focus, it seems, over these past couple of weeks and heading into Election Day on November 5th is going to be these battleground states, these 7 battleground states that you guys have talked so much about and that we've talked about here in the past, and the torrent of ads and campaign appearances that the folks that live in these states are experiencing. I want to start with you, Seth. You've been out on the road in a couple of different places all across the country, but Pennsylvania, North Carolina, Arizona, Michigan, Nevada, Wisconsin, Georgia, those are the 7 states that we're talking about that essentially will decide this 2024 presidential race. In your travels and just in your conversations with people, whether they're voters or whether they're officials, are you seeing any movement among the sentiments of the people out there in terms of all these appearances and all these ads and the targeting that they're getting from, the national body politic at large? Or are they kind of, hey, we are Republicans and we're voting for Trump, or we are Democrats and we're voting for Harris? Is it that simple, or is it more complicated?
It's that simple, and it's more complicated, right? So there are a ton of Democrats that were locked in, probably locked in, in 2 years ago, right, or whatever, and lots of Republicans who were locked in probably 2 years ago. But there are still this kind of floating around group of undecided or quote unquote persuadable voters that still likely hold the election in their hands. It's one of those things. It's hard to pin down how big of a pool of people this is, but I think estimates are like 10%, 20% of the electorate, maybe. So in states, say Arizona, that was won in 2020 by 11,000 or so votes, if I got that right. In Georgia, it was a somewhat similar margin. You head up into the blue wall states of Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and what's the other one? Michigan. Again, I think it was 154,000 votes altogether up there. So these voters definitely can swing things. And I think the campaigns right now, I'd say the 2 states I'd say that are really getting a ton of attention are Pennsylvania, which people just think Pennsylvania is sort of the do or die of the situation. It's home to a lot of the working class voters that Donald Trump is trying to ride to victory. And then on the flip side, it has very big urban centers that Kamala Harris is leaning on and hoping on to rebuild that quote unquote Obama coalition that has driven Democrats to victory in the last few presidential races. And then on top of that, like I said, North Carolina, where I think, Democrats at least are holding out hope that Harris can put that in play in much the same way Barack Obama did in 2008 by rallying a lot of the black voters at the end of the day, female black voters, and then leaning on white women in the suburbs. And I think, you basically take that coalition and you kind of can jump around the map. And that's what Harris is trying to do. And again, on the flip side, Trump's more trying to build out that working class appeal to swamp the polls, as he says.
Yeah. And Susan, to that point, it's not only voters, but the specific constituencies of voters. You wrote recently how Harris is trying to make inroads with black men specifically, a lot of whom have defected and voted for Trump, and it's a category that historically Democrats have counted on being in their corner, but that's not necessarily been the case in the last couple of elections. But maybe it might be far too gone now at this point, only a month or so before the election, to do this media blitz where she's on the Breakfast Club and Howard Stern and trying to reach people that may not be your average political audience by going on some non-traditional and making some non-traditional media appearances. But is any of that working to her advantage, or it's more she's behind the 8 ball in trying to court that constituency now so late in the game?
Well, she's doing a lot better than Biden did with black voters. And that gap shrunk pretty quickly once she jumped into the race. The problem is it doesn't take much of a shift for a big difference. Black voters made up 17 million voters in 2020. So just a few percentage points, and you're giving a sizable chunk back to Republicans. And don't forget, the difference in the two races in 2020 was very, very narrow. So that's why it matters so much. Now, is Trump going to carry away the African American vote? No, of course not. But will he get more than any Republican since Richard Nixon in 1960? Possibly he will. Right now, he's on track to potentially get 20%, maybe. That I think that's the high number people are looking at. But you have to look at the individual states where it's really going to matter. Georgia is one of the battlegrounds where Trump really needs to win, and the black vote there is more significant. So you have Harris trying to dump out the vote in the urban areas like Atlanta, where you can get, they just swamp the vote there for Democrats. They can make up for losing votes in other parts of the state where Trump is stronger. He's trying to win over the black vote there, and so is she. That's why you see them both going there a lot. In fact, later this week, Barack Obama will be in Georgia, and you know that part of the reason he's there is he's trying to rally the black vote. He's trying to rally all voters. He was a very popular Democratic president, but in particular, they're trying to get this vote. So Hispanic votes matter also, but they're not as big of a part of the electorate at this point, although they're growing and growing as part of the electorate. So that's why people say, well, look how well he's doing with Hispanics. He's doing even better with Hispanics. They just don't make up as much of the whole pie of voters. The black vote is like, if Trump does win, part of the reason will be because of black voters. And it's not just black men, black women. If you look at the CNN New York Times poll that came out in October, when you compare how people voted in 2020 with who they say they're going to vote now, and this was a poll of likely black voters, so it's considered, reliable in that sense. By Harris's support amongst black women has dropped considerably from what Biden won in 2020. Now, those aren't apple to apple comparisons because they're two different measurements, but you're still seeing fewer black female voters supporting Harris, which is really surprising. So it's going to be a big part of the discussion on election day and thereafter, depending on when we find out who the winner is. How these people voted. Was it all hype? Is Trump really going to get and he may have their support, but are they going to come out and actually vote for him, or are they just going to stay home and not vote for Harris? That hurts Harris as well. But there's a big difference though, coming out and pulling a lever for Trump. It's going to be the voters I've talked to, and I've talked to a lot of black voters, you definitely see it amongst male voters. They're like, Trump, yeah, they're at least thinking about him, or they're excited about him. They're not necessarily going to vote for him, but he's a real thing for them, and they cite the economy, they cite his populist image on it, and also criminal justice reform they talk about when he was president. So there are all these reasons why they support him, and I think it's a really interesting part of this election, how that shakes out.
And yeah, it's a perfect segue into, we've got this battle between undecided voters, and you see them on panels on TV after the debates, and it's like, seeing a albino tiger. It's like, oh, look, undecided voters, who are they? And where do they come from? I want to ask you, Seth, because you wrote a story recently about it. I thought was pretty interesting about how some undecided voters are even losing some of their friends because they haven't made a choice yet. But to Susan's point, I think that, and for me, it's always been turnout. And I'll give just a few percentage numbers nationally. 2012, 58.6% of the electorate voted. 2016, that went up to 60%. And then in 2020, 66.6% of all Americans eligible to vote voted. I think that number's trending upward, which if you are civic minded, great, more people are voting. But from a real sense in terms of how this will decide the election, I think it's motivating people, not necessarily undecided voters, who are they going to pick, but people who are registered to vote and either are apathetic to the system and the process at this point for both candidates, whether it was Biden and then Harris or Trump, or B, just say, the very classic, my vote doesn't count, and just end up not going to the polls forever. And then not to mention that in the past, specifically in 2020 2020, we saw a lot of split ticket voting, or you don't mark somebody on the presidential race, and then you vote for governor and you vote for senator and you vote for your representative. So even that goes on to, I think, a greater extent now than it used to in American politics, that those type of things in there affect the numbers. And we won't really know the true extent of that until we get exit polling data. But Seth, you've talked to actual undecided voters. They do exist, but do you think that they're going to be the big sway in this election, and specifically in those 7 states that we've been talking about?
I mean, my guess is yes, but you know, uh, we are definitely in the speculation game at this point because we don't know exactly how big of a pool those voters are. But um, you know, it's all about at this point. Politics is about addition, they say, right? So if you can get those undecideds to join your team, great. But politics is also by addition by subtraction. So Susan and I were talking about this the other day, where and she touched on that. If you can keep people at home that might vote for Harris, or you can keep people at home that might vote for Trump, that's a plus one on your part. Um, so both campaigns are going to be working along those lines. And you touched on kind of like voter sentiment, George. And I should have said this before. The voters I talk to, man, almost universally, you could be a Harris supporter, a Trump supporter. There is a deep level of uh, disillusionment with the system, anxiety, frustration, unease. There's just, a lot of people still aren't happy with their choices. So even though the election has been immensely polarizing, within that polarization, there is, and that the energy that goes along with that polarization, there is a large swath of people that are just kind of bummed out by the whole deal and, want to move on from it. Um, and so that's just one of those wild cards in this race. And I guess one more thing I'd add, just when I was in Pennsylvania recently, I was in Erie, which is a bellwether part of Pennsylvania, and it was very easy to find a former Democrat who was voting for Trump, a union member who recently changed their voter registration to Republican, and they were sick of Democrats for this reason or whatever. I think basically most of the time it came down, they felt economically left behind. But on the flip side, it was just as easy to find Republicans who would never vote for Trump, who were just kind of totally turned off by his bombastic style and just wanted a sense of normality to come back to politics. And it wasn't about policy because they would probably totally disagree with Kamala Harris on policy. Um, but it was just this idea that maybe we can just move on from the noise of the Trump era, and that's good enough for me.
Yeah, and Susan, to Seth's point there, it doesn't take much, and to your point about black voters, all you need is maybe up 1 or 2% in any of those kind of key groups. If you're Trump, who's taking away numbers from a traditional Democratic group, or if you're Harris, and you can get a couple of key percentage points, the Republicans for Harris effort to try to, that Liz Cheney and some other folks are leading, to try and pick off a couple of percentage points there that may go the other way. There really is. It's going to come down to the margins, it seems like, in this race in those states.
In some of them, absolutely, especially the battleground states where they were, divided in some cases by 12,000, fewer than 12,000 votes. It's going to really matter how you get the vote out. And that's what the focus is now. You hear both campaigns talking about that. The Biden, then what became the Harris campaign, I think have staffed more and poured more money into campaign offices. I mean, they've got campaign offices in Florida where people don't really think that the Democrats have a great chance of succeeding because they're outnumbered in voters by about 1 million people. But they're still down in Florida trying to get the vote out. So they've done better with the physical, brick and mortar aspect of this. And I think now you see with the Trump campaign, they're pouring it all into getting out the vote efforts now. Early voting is something that you didn't hear from the Trump campaign 4 years ago or even 2 years ago, because, President Trump did this thing where he got up on stage and said, well, you should have same day voting. And he cast doubt on the whole early voting, mail-in balloting, and all these other ways of voting. Now he's changed his tune, rightfully so, if he wants to win, because you have to play by the rules in each state or you're not going to win. So he's talking about early voting. A lot of conservative, luminaries are out there telling them, get out and vote. If you listen to Mark Levin, conservative radio host, very popular. I think every night he's been railing against people not mailing their ballots in yet. He's like, "You got your ballot, mail it in." Republicans are trying to play that game now, and they've never done it before. Traditionally, it was same day voting. There was some early voting, but that the vast majority of voting happened on same day. The mail-in stuff was only in certain states. Of course, the pandemic changed all that, and we all knew 4 years ago, because this is the way it's always been, that Democrats participate in much greater numbers in mail-in voting. Is that going to stay the same over time? No, it'll probably change because everyone's getting on board now with it. So it'll be interesting to see. Right now, you have people measuring who is asking for ballots and trying to determine who might have the upper hand or who has already mailed in their ballots. And you're seeing more Democrats having mailed in their ballots in some of these battleground states, causing this sort of early panic with Republicans of mail your ballot in. So this is an experiment in some ways for the Republican Party, just to see how well they do in a presidential election where they've gone all in on these new ways of voting instead of just, we all know, and Seth and I have written about this, Trump's, I think one of his fallacies was continuing to rail against that kind of thing. And what that does is maybe makes his voters doubt the system, and maybe they don't go vote at all. So they why bother? This was part of the 2020 race to fill the Georgia Senate seats. So
Just on that point, I was talking to the chairman of the Georgia GOP the other day, and he said the way he has been presenting that to groups this election cycle is to say, like, listen, if I was the football coach of the University of Georgia and I said, I'm not going to run any plays until the fourth quarter, and then we're going to be throwing touchdowns and going nuts, people would fire me, right? And so he likened that to the election. He's like, you got to use the tools that are available to you, and that's what we're doing this election cycle.
We'll see how Republicans do. Are they going to, that's be another thing, and I'm watching for, not just who wins and who shows up to vote, but how the voting goes down and how Republicans participate in mail-in and early voting, et cetera. So that's going to be, this will change over time. The more it becomes part of the system and more states are doing this, you'll see Democrats' advantage will shrink, and they know that. So
well, the fun thing with it is we see all these numbers, and actually the Trump and the campaign and the RNC say that what they've seen from mail-ins and all that stuff is actually really good because it exceeds where they were in previous years. But we still don't know what that means, right? Like, so, a lot of these people who typically vote on election day could have cast in their ballot, right? Does that mean the pool is bigger? We don't know. It could be, but it also could just be people that are doing it now rather than later.
Yeah. We live in a country that loves and prioritizes convenience, and of course that's extended to our voting and our voting methods, depending on the state that you live in. Another thing that people are prioritizing are issues. We've talked in our debate recaps over the past couple of months a lot about what people are motivated by, what is driving people to vote or maybe even not to vote. And Susan, I'll start with you there on that. If you could peg a top one or two issues that are motivating people, or that you hear people continually bring up in your conversations and in your reporting, that are the major factors for them in this election cycle.
Economy, abortion, immigration. It depends on who does the poll. You'll see people say democracy, and you say, well, what's that? They fear the future of democracy. That's another top one. Those four generally are the most important issues that voters are talking about. When I talk to voters, they talk about inflation. When I talk to people who support Harris, they talk about abortion, and they worry about what's going to happen under Republican presidency. A lot of people bought into the Project 2025 line that Democrats are using skillfully to try to scare off Republican voters who might vote for Trump, because they think it's going to take away women's rights. And those are the things that I hear directly from the voters. And when you look at the polls and you look how they rank these things, hear a lot about immigration. Immigration is always at the top pretty much, because it's just such a big story, and it's happening everywhere in the country. It's not just at the border. And then you look at abortion, and you look at how they rank these things, here a lot about immigration. Immigration is always at the top pretty much, because it's just such a big story, and it's happening everywhere in the country. It's not just at the border. there are immigrants who are spread throughout the country who these communities have to take care of, and it's strained the system. So that's another big one. And of course, people talk about, just their wallets, how things have gone under Biden. And, it's just the real visceral stuff. And they always say when people go vote, they vote based on what's closest to them, what affects them the most. And it's interesting because not everybody who has a direct link to something going on at the border, but they'll say things like, well, they're taking our money, they're taking our jobs, or, even though it may not be taking their job personally, but they don't like the idea of it. They don't like the idea of providing all this taxpayer money to people who are here illegally. So that's what I'm hearing. I'm sure, I bet you Seth is hearing something similar.
Yeah, I mean, I think the key with I think on the issue set is just the things that are affecting you kind of on a day-to-day basis.
Mhm.
So,
Right.
and I think for most voters, is going to the grocery store. Like stuff's more expensive, and people like to talk about the price of bacon. This cycle seems to be the big, you know, metaphor for
Yeah.
that. And I think so. On the flip side of that, the other, it's not necessarily an issue, but it's a thing or a person, is Donald Trump. That's the driving issue for a lot of Democrats still. Uh,
And
it's stop Trump.
Republicans who don't like
Yeah,
right.
exactly. Liz Cheney, Republicans. Um, so again, the election, man, you kind of we keep coming back to this over and over again, but it's like for a lot of Trump supporters, even the ones that don't like him, it's about policy. It's about, I want prices lower. I want the border under control. I want to stop inflation, blah, blah, blah. For Democrats, it's really a character thing, and it's Trump's a bad person. And he has no moral compass, and he's going to lead the nation astride, and he's a threat to people, right? So those are the two driving forces. So the issue set is pretty defined, but I think like you got to call it Trump derangement syndrome. That could be overblown it with a lot of voters, but that element is out there, and it's an issue. We'll call it an issue.
Yeah, I like that. That's a perfect way to get us to our final point, and that's a projection, which we'll see how this goes. Of course, on election day, we're not going to know Tuesday night likely. We're not going to know Wednesday morning likely. It's a process in terms of how different states count their votes. Some states choose to count their votes before November 5th. Some states will choose to count their votes after November 5th, a beautiful part of the democratic process across the country. But, and I will lay out just in a numerical sense, because I'm one of these people that likes, looking at the map and seeing, the state of play of everything. New York, Pennsylvania, and Illinois, traditional quote unquote Democratic states, all lost an electoral vote. And so that's something else to remember, that now here in 2024, we are post reapportionment that happens every 10 years after the census, and that reallocates electoral votes and congressional seats across the country. So those three states all lost a seat. Texas gained 2, Florida gained 1, and North Carolina gained 1. And with that map layout, if Donald Trump wins Pennsylvania, North Carolina, Georgia, one of Maine's electoral votes, which is a state that splits theirs along with Nebraska, and carries all the other states that he won 4 years ago, that's 270 on the nose, and he's the president. If somehow you flip Georgia and Michigan, and Georgia goes for Kamala Harris, and Michigan also goes for Kamala Harris, then we're at a 269 tie. So in my opinion, I believe we are on track for the closest margin of electoral votes since 2000, since Bush Gore and the Supreme Court decision in Florida, and hanging chads, and everybody who lived through that remembers how much of an arduous process that was, that took till December to figure out the winner of the election. So Seth, I'll start with you. If you don't have a number or a person for me, do you have a projection of something that we're going to see, or a state or something unique that we're going to find out once we finally get to November 5th?
Well, I think people, if watching this, they should go to 270 to win, because you can have all sorts of fun mixing and matching states to try to figure out how to, reach the threshold. My one prediction is that there are going to be a lot of disappointed voters on the day after the election, because, or whenever this race is finally called one way or the other, because there is adamant belief of among Harris supporters and among Trump supporters that their candidate's going to win, right? Or the other candidate, maybe this is a better way to put it, the other candidate has to be stopped, right? So let's say November 10th, once all the dust has settled, there's going to be some people struggling to sleep, thinking, oh my God, I got to live with Harris for 4 years, or I got to live with Trump for 4 years. That's all I got, George, for a prediction.
I know. I like it. I like it. Susan, any kind of projection or thought on what we'll see come Election Day?
I'll throw out a wild card. If it is 269 to 269, of course, it's all going to come down to the split districts in Nebraska, Omaha. Who would have thought Omaha would have anything to do with deciding the presidential election? Well, it can, because they divide up by congressional district, and this one district is likely to go for Harris, according to polls. So if you have 269 to 269, which, as you say, is possible, it's a very close election, and we could end up with that. So what happens? They flip a coin? I mean, what happens? No, it goes to the Congress, and it goes to the newly seated Congress. So we don't even know who that's going to be yet. So then you have to guess, who might that be? Well, maybe we have a Republican House and a Democratic Senate. Then you have two different groups deciding the president and the vice president. And you could end up with some bizarre situation. And it hasn't happened in modern history. And I feel like this is a year where it really is possible that we could end up with 269 and 269. And so then we'll be waiting to, don't forget, in the past several election cycles, determining who controlled the House has taken weeks sometimes, because some of these races, especially out in California, some of the races have taken a long time to count and recount, and because they're so close, a lot of recounts demanded, takes a while. We may not know who the president is, and it's all going to be based on other congressional races and who controls the Senate and who controls the House. To me, that would be the most interesting scenario, and it is possible. It's not 100% going to happen, but we know it's really close. So we could have something really historic here, and a real nail biter that could drag on a la 2000 with only in a different way, with the recount with Bush and Gore. So get ready.
Yeah, so much still to unfold and just a few days away. Seth McLaughlin, Susan Ferrechio, I thank you as always. It's been fun.
Thanks a lot.
Thanks, George.
And a reminder that you can find all of our election coverage at WashingtonTimes.com/elections, where you can find maps, stories, videos, and more. WashingtonTimes.com/elections. For the Washington Times, I'm George Gerbo. Thanks for watching.